First, I want to thank Andy and Rhonda for inviting me here. I want to thank you all for showing up. Obviously, there's a number of places you can be on Saturday afternoon at 3 p.m., and I'm happy to have you here. As Rhonda said, my name is Ryon Cobb. Obviously, I'm a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Southern California. My presentation today is examining racial inequality in survey data, evidence from the General Social Survey. So broadly, I'm a scholar of race and ethnic relations, or race and ethnicity in the United States. Specifically, my work looks at how social activities as well as social identities shape race-related outcomes. And there are various race-related outcomes my research explores. It includes racial attitudes, measurements of skin tone, measurements of racial identity, and health disparities. The presentation today will go as follows. First, I'll provide a broad overview of the General Social Survey. Following this, I'll look at the innovative strengths of the General Social Survey, specifically for studies that examine how social activity, and specifically congregational involvement, shape race-related attitudes in the United States. Afterwards, I'll look at the weaknesses of the General Social Survey for studies related to measuring race-related outcomes, and specifically measuring skin tone of American poor adults in the United States. So broadly, the General Social Survey is a nationally representative study of non-institutionalized adults age 18 or older. The study tends to range between 1,500 and 3,000 respondents per year. The interviews are conducted face-to-face, and that's in contrast to interviews called on the phone by pollsters. GSS interviews actually fly to the respondent's address. They interview them in person. The interview tends to be 90 minutes. The time span of the survey started in 1973 and fielded annually from 1973 to 1993. Beginning in 1994, it's a biannual survey, so 94, 96, 98, 2000, so on and so forth. The design is cross-sectional, meaning largely individuals. It means a national representative sample of different individuals are interviewed over time. Beginning in 2004, however, half of the GSS respondents are longitudinal. It means it'll follow the same individuals over time, over the span of 4 years. GSS has two components. The first is the replicating core. These are items that are asked consistently over time. So obviously we'll have information on the demographics, your age, your racial and ethnic identity that's asked every year, as well as your income and your years of education, so on and so forth. We also have topical modules, and these vary from years. So there may be a mental health topical module in the GSS 1 year. There may be something related to race-related outcomes in another year, so on and so forth. So again, we have the majority of the survey is the replicating core. That's largely 90 minutes of the survey. These are questions asked of all respondents every year. In certain years, we have certain topical studies, which are certain questions that are asked of specific respondents that may vary from year to year. Now, the innovative strengths of the General Social Survey. So as I mentioned before, the General Social Survey is a nationally representative study of adults age 18 or older in the United States. Every 2 years since 1994, GSS interviewers will go to your house and have face-to-face interviews, and those interviews will tend to last from 90 to 120 minutes. And specifically in 1998 and 2006, the General Social Survey asked its respondents to identify what congregation, if any, attend the United States. From there, we have the basis for the National Congregation Study. The National Congregation Study is a nationally representative sample of congregations in the United States. So P.I. Mark James at Duke University, his team interviewed the pastors of the congregations identified from the General Social Survey to get an understanding of the demographic factors of congregations in the United States. By putting both together, we have an identity, we can match the individual to the congregation that they attend, which is important for studies of religion because now we can understand how organizational characteristics, let's say the size of a congregation, or the service time, the clergy's educational attainment, if those factors also influence above and beyond individual factors for shaping understandings of racial inequality. So I give a brief overview of one study that's currently in review. It's congregational size and racial attitudes in the United States. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the mega churches within religious landscape in America, or these very large congregations. So my colleagues and I asked, does congregational size account for differences in how individuals understand racial inequality? Right? The idea would be from organizational sociologists that the larger the size, the more isolated individuals feel within these organizations. And since isolation is also associated with racial attitudes, we will argue that individuals who attend these larger congregations will have more beliefs about inequality that are less about the system and about the individual. Does that make sense? So they're more likely to say that the reason why blacks lag behind whites in terms of income in the United States is because it's not because of the structure or the system or racial discrimination, it's more based on the individual. So our aims inside this study, number one, we want to explore the influence of congregational size on the explanations individuals offer for racial inequality. And number two, we want to see if there are other organizational or or individual level factors that also contribute to racial inequality attitudes. So we use the survey described prior, the merged version of the General Social Survey with the National Congregation Study. So we can again examine how organizational characteristics shape racial inequality attitudes among individuals, religiously active Americans. So what we find is consistent with our beliefs is individuals who are attending larger congregations tend to be like, it's not the system, right? Racial discrimination is not the reason that blacks lag behind whites. The effect is significant before and after entering in certain other factors, such as are they a Republican, or if we take into consideration if they're the political composition of their congregation, or the racial ethnic diversity of their congregation. So we see from this study that individuals who attend larger churches are more likely to say it's not the system, right? We do not have significant results for our other models, so we found that specifically individuals who attend larger congregations aren't any different in terms of their attitudes and believe that it's the actual individual and that it's the personal feelings of blacks, and that explains why they lag behind whites. So blacks are lazy. They're no less different from others in terms of that belief. So larger major finding, again, going back to number one, individuals in the United States who attend these larger congregations are more likely to say or have these systems, or are less likely to have the system upholding beliefs. So that's one innovative strength of the General Social Survey. For sociologists of religion, it connects the organization to the actual individual to allow us to understand how organizational characteristics, specifically with religious congregations, shape individuals' attitudes in the United States. Now, there's a second innovative strength and possibly weakness in the General Social Survey. In 2012, specifically, the GSS asked interviewers assess the actual skin tone of their respondents using a scale, individuals who are familiar with this, the NIS scale by Massey. They asked individuals, they asked them to hold their hands, and they had a chart very similar to the one here to measure their skin tone inside. And why is skin tone important? Well, we know among blacks and among other racial minority groups, people who have darker skin tone tend to earn less, tend to be less likely to marry, tend to have poor health outcomes than lighter skinned colleagues in the United States. And so for studies of skin tone and racial inequality, having measures of skin tone that specifically are interviewer assessed may provide us insight into how skin tone shapes inequality in other studies. And specifically, unlike other studies that may ask these questions just among blacks or just among Hispanics, all individuals in the General Social Survey were asked this question. So we have the skin tone ratings for blacks, whites, Hispanics, as well as multiracials in the United States, which gives us a broader perspective of how skin tone may shape inequality attitudes in the United States. So in this paper, with a colleague, we asked, does the race ethnicity of the interview, so does the person asking the questions and doing the measurement, actually account for differences in how they rate their skin tone, right? And so prior research looked at this among urban populations and has found among blacks and whites that there are differences. So a black interviewer may see a person and rate their skin tone differently than a white interviewer may see the same person or someone with the same skin tone and rate their skin tone, right? And so this is actually a measurement issue. Are there actually differences? Now, prior to this, on the scale, Michael Hughes would argue that having more of a continuous measure of skin tone will reduce the variations that we may find in the racial ethnic differences in race and skin tone, right? So individuals should be able to see your skin tone if they actually have the same type of chart and they're looking directly at you. Does that make sense? So we explore if this is actually if this effect is explained away by other interviewer level characteristics. And what we find specifically for this one is that there is a race of interviewer effect. That in comparison to white interviewers, black interviewers tend to rate individuals who are white, Hispanic, black, and multiracial, they tend to be lighter than their white colleagues. So what this suggests is that even though interviewers have the same chart, and they may be looking at individuals with the same skin tone, that their racial background may influence how they actually see or perceive the other individual. We find very similarly for Hispanic interviewers, we find very little effects. So those Hispanic interviewers, in comparison to whites, they're viewing blacks as well as the same. They're viewing whites. There's really no difference in how they're viewing or seeing other individuals, except for Hispanics, who tend to be a little bit lighter than they tend to rate other Hispanics as a little bit lighter than their white counterparts. We see in terms of the multiracial interviewers, they're really, and only for Hispanics, and that effect is weak, that really more or less, that multiracial individuals see blacks, whites, Hispanics, and multiracials as very similarly in ways that are similar to whites. Now, why is that important? So in results I'm not showing here, we actually measured if there's a race, what does the race of interviewer effect controlling for it do for skin tone and, let's say, educational attainment. And so there are some studies that argue that skin tone has no influence on the educational attainment of blacks and white, blacks and specifically Hispanics in the United States. Those studies don't contain race of interviewer effect. when you control for racial interview effect, the size of the coefficient, for those in the room who do survey work, increases, and the significance of the coefficient goes from p-value goes from what, 0.12 to 0.001. So that means that it has somewhat of a, when you control for race of interview, skin tone effect actually has more, it shows more statistically significant variations. I'm being told to move to the side.
And that box right there.
Inside the box.
Behind you, I was trying to, with the tape is behind you.
Behind you.
Move the chair.
This chair.
And there should be tape.
Okay. I stand in the box. Okay, cool. Sorry about that.
No.
So we see, again, having, and so the weakness inside this study, the weakness inside the general social survey is that we're seeing individuals' background characteristics are still influencing how they see other individuals, which in turn leads to some type of measurement error inside our studies. So we may be observing things that we are insignificant, that in fact, when we actually control for the background characteristics of the interviewer, it are statistically significant. So I want to give a brief, again, overview. So again, this presentation explored the general social survey, which is a nationally representative sample of Americans aged 18 or older in the United States. We looked at the strengths of the survey as it relates to studies of religion as well as racial inequality. So one specific strength is that it provides us access to the organizational characteristics. So instead of just looking how individual level factors shape people's beliefs, we actually can look at how the organization, which is important for sociology and religion, may also independently contribute to how people, what people believe about white inequality. Specifically, number two, we also look at the weaknesses of the general social survey as it relates to measuring skin tone, especially in light of the growing amount of research on skin tone and inequality-related outcomes in the United States. We find that the race or background of the interviewer actually influences the measurement of skin tone among individuals. And so future research or future goals for the general social survey should include more of a continuous measure of skin tone that's rated by an actual machine, such as the one in the Cardia study. And by that, we can remove some of the measurement errors within the studies, as well as sociology of religion. We need, obviously, more longitudinal data of how congregations, or how members, individual affiliation congregations actually influence racial inequality attitudes over time. I thank you for your time, and please feel free to ask any questions after the next speaker. Thank you.
Hey, what's up now? Brother, what's up? This is a groovy party, man. Yeah, brother, I can dig it. Solid. Right on.